to a very focused podcast. Instead of like kind of ping-ponging around what's going on, like have an in-depth conversation is something that is very interesting in the sports betting landscape, because in theory, it could change the way business is done, or it could be a gigantic flop. And so that's kind of where we want to go with all of this. And if you are familiar with the industry, you know we're talking about the DraftKings Surcharge thing that they brought up on the earnings call. And Adam, I'll kick it to you to kind of do the nuts and bolts of all of this to fill people in that weren't following along with all of that. But this will be where the focus of the discussion will be today.
It made sense to me that this is the issue that everyone in the industry is talking about, and we have gone into depth over the last few days in our coverage of it. Notably today, we're recording this on a Wednesday, and I'm going to direct everybody right from the start to a fantastic piece that Eric did, running some numbers and diving into what it would mean in practice for DraftKings to put a surcharge on winning bettors in high-tax states. That is the crux of what we're talking about here. If you've been on some summer vacation, you don't know of the news. DraftKings announced on its Q2 earnings presentation that it has plans to implement a surcharge of 3 to 4% on winning bets in certain high-tax states. There are 4 of them: Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And this comes ostensibly in response to Illinois raising its tax rate to the highest level of 40. It's a tiered system between 20% and 40%. We already know what New York is at 51%. There's been so much talk of how will operators respond to these high taxes. Will they eventually pass the costs on to bettors? And we looked at it and thought, well, maybe they'll do it by hiding it in futures markets or places where the hold is not so obvious, right? No, DraftKings came out and said, we're going to do it in a much more obvious way. And Jason Robbins talked a lot about that. I'll stop there because we're going to get into a lot of the details of this and let you guys talk a little bit more.
Yeah, so Eric, one of the interesting things about this, again, is in our previous lives, there's always been talk of like, how do you make these businesses more profitable? How do you go about it? We knew back in the poker world, how much rake was being taken out of various tournaments and stuff like that was always a little gray area type stuff. You know, sometimes there was transparency, sometimes there was not. Sometimes your jaw would hit when you're like, oh my God, really? They were taking that much rake out. We saw the same thing in the DFS world as well, right? Where it was oh my God, that tournament had a 27% rake and all, you know, it goes on, but it is the way that these companies make money. A little bit harder to hide that on the sports betting side of things. As Adam mentioned, sure, you can kind of mask it in the futures markets and stuff like that, but bettors are going to figure that out. And once that gets out or whatever, then of course, if you start adjusting juice, that is very, very obvious, you know, whenever you start to see that as well. So again, you've seen it kind of under the table in the poker world. You've seen it kind of under the table in the DFS world. This is a different approach where it's right out in front of you. It's like, no, this is just what we're doing. And we're going to sit there and just line item it for you.
Yeah, happens to be the very same cast of characters that we saw in DFS. We're talking about really DraftKings and FanDuel here and how they're going to handle this notion of fees. I think we learned in the DFS days that customers aren't broadly very price sensitive until something like this happens, until, an operator takes it one step too far and until they feel like they're being taken advantage of. So some of the question I have out of this decision from DraftKings is, how many customers will feel like they're being taken advantage of versus how many will, believe that DraftKings has a good enough product that it's worth the extra juice on their bets. So funny you bring up DFS because really lots of parallels between what we saw with the sort of fee wars, the VIG wars in DFS versus what we see now. And I will say one thing that has changed is the transparency. At least DraftKings is putting it right on the bet slip so the bettor knows exactly what they're getting into. That's a little different from the previous versions of these fee wars we've had. But yeah, lots of parallels to the old DFS battle between these two as well.
Adam, as a bettor yourself and me as a bettor, I will say this before we kind of dig into what we think here. I at least do respect the transparency part of it, because as you mentioned, you could have tried to do this on the low, right? Like, again, you build it into all these markets that an unsophisticated bettor wouldn't understand that it's getting built into, right? And so at least at least, and this is not a defense of what's going on, and we'll get into how we actually feel about all this, but at the very least, the transparency is at least nice, right? Where we're not like uncovering this or whatever. It's kind of like, hey, here's what we're going to do, and it's the damn light item on your ticket.
Might be some, a little bit of Hershey's syrup and expired milk, to put it that way. But I think you look at this fee and ask, well, why is it as transparent as it is? Because in a way, it is an attempt by DraftKings to get people upset about these taxes. It is an attempt to get their customers mad about it, and for DraftKings to say, hey, don't blame us. We're not the ones who put this tax structure in place. They are essentially trying to achieve a uniform tax rate of roughly 20%, and all of these states come in above 20%. Now, politically, I don't think it's smart calculus. I don't know that people are going to necessarily think, I'm going to go to my legislator and say, why are you making the taxes on poor DraftKings so high? No, they're going to look around in all of these markets where they have a lot of options and say, all right, I'm just going to use my other app if I'm worried that I'm going to get taxed by DraftKings. I just wonder if the money potentially raised, which Eric has estimated at up to $220 million annually, depending on the way this is all structured, I do wonder if the perception hit that DraftKings is going to take here will be worth it. But, big but, the question is, will anyone else come out and do the same? Did DraftKings provide cover for anybody else to implement a similar surcharge? We've already seen BetRivers, obviously a much lower market share operator, come out and say that they do not have plans to do that. FanDuel's earnings call is tomorrow, and that is the big one that we're waiting to see, because if FanDuel says we're not doing it, DraftKings could get left on a pretty lonely island here.
So, Eric, let's look at this kind of like the big picture here. And a lot of people go like, I don't even understand. Why in the hell would DraftKings do something like this? And so it is a for-profit business, right? I mean, the goal is to make money in doing all of this. And so we start to look at these tax rates and people say, yeah, well, it's only in those states. But we've already seen states come back in and start to raise taxes. Like, they review stuff, they raise taxes. There's really no reason to believe that if this is a common practice and this works out, that almost every state will probably at some point come back around and revisit this and start to raise taxes, right? Well, then now we're looking at a business that already operates on fairly slim margins as it is anyway, having to pay these really, really crazy high taxes. And you start to then at that point wonder about the viability of the business overall, right? And so I think people step back and go like, dude, this is so stupid. Why in the hell would you ever do that? But it's almost like trying to get ahead of it, right? It's like trying to cut it off at the pass here because, yeah, it's just these states right now, but we still have California and Texas to come. Why in the world would Texas and California take anything less than 50% or more if they decide to pass anything, if it's working in all of these other states? And then the other states that currently have it go back and they meet in their legislature, and then Bob talks to Tom and Tom talks to Frank, and they go, did you see what happened over here? Well, why the hell are we only charging this? So it's kind of like a deal of, they're almost trying to play defense here, right?
Yeah, just a quick thought on that too. You have to wonder though, if this might have the opposite impact, and states might see that DraftKings is charging a fee and say, well, why don't we just raise the tax rate a little bit then? If they're, I think there's a chance that this could really backfire in that way in some states. More broadly, to your point, yes, this is clearly a response to the market conditions in some of these states that make it difficult for DraftKings to have a profitable business. It's also something that has been coming since PASPA. We've talked about how the market leaders in particular have chosen to operate by, giving away a ton of money to customers and essentially securing their foothold in this marketplace. But that has to come back. You have to pay the piper at some point. And we've known for a long time that something was going to have to change in the status quo, the way this industry exists right now. It just happens to be DraftKings taking the first step here to at its core, this is about DraftKings looking out for its future as a company and trying to find a way to be more profitable in this space than it currently is being.
Guys, I want to push back a little bit on this idea because it's based on the concept of small margins, right? Of profit margins being very thin, which traditionally has been the case. We know that's what sports betting has been about for decades on decades. And of course, the history of sports betting as we know it is generally attached to a casino as an amenity and something that has never really been the main profit center for a company, right? For a casino, that if you're getting by on the historical 5%-ish margins, that, yeah, you do need volume in order to make that happen. Well, DraftKings et al., FanDuel pioneered this, are taking a different approach. They're pushing everybody to much higher hold products in order to make this all work, right? Same game parlays, and the fact that Jason Robbins has been someone, the CEO of DraftKings, who came out there and said, yeah, we think parlays are a win-win, right? We think customers are getting the best of this too. Well, in a way, this is a response to that, where I think people are looking at it and saying, well, hold on a second. You're telling us that this works because your margins, your hold, are more like 11, 12, 13% in good months, right? You're making a lot more profit than other companies are. And the response from those sports books is, well, that's the cost of operating in the regulated space, X, Y, and Z. Is it though? Or is it the cost of being able to show growth to shareholders? That's the reality. We understand that, and we respect that as well. But I do think some of the pushback you're seeing is that DraftKings has been very forward in its discussion of pushing people to higher margin products and talking about the fact that they don't want winning bettors, right? That long term, they don't want winning bettors, and they're putting a surcharge now on winning bets. Eric can tell you more about the mechanics of why we think they're doing it that way to try to avoid some tax burdens. But I think some of this is DraftKings getting the response from the public that is based on the steps they've taken in the past that have been to say, yeah, we're trying to make more profit.
Yeah, and so here's the thing about that, though, to me. What happens is the lifetime value of that type of bettor is not very long, and it's not very high, right? Because those bettors are the bettors that flame out, and those the bettors are the bettors that don't last a long time, right? So it's kind of like it's a chicken and egg thing. Like what we're going. So it's like they need to make the profit, as much profit on those people as they can now, because again, the lifetime value of those people isn't very long. So again, it kind of goes back. I know what you're saying about, like, yeah, it's higher profit margins, and certainly they make more than a traditional sports book did a decade ago, brick and mortar here in Las Vegas or something. But at the same time, the business model is predicated on being able to sustain the churn that comes with that type of client, right? And again, if you're eating into that margin with these crazy high tax rates, then it does change kind of the structure and certainly the future of any potential growth and or profitability.
You're right. Churn is something that has to be factored in. But I also say, when it comes to lifetime value, look back at the last few earnings presentations from DraftKings, roughly about a year ago especially, where they talked about same-state growth and the fact that same-state growth was actually fueling their march toward profitability. Right now, some of that same-state growth is because they're pulling back on marketing costs and they already have the customers there. But the idea of churn, if we're going to talk about it that way, if we're going to talk about churn with DraftKings, we talk about churn with everybody and say, are we necessarily churning 12% hold players? Probably some, yeah. But if what the American customer wants is $20 same game parlays with 17 legs, then maybe they're not all churning, right? I think there's a question that's a reasonable question that we might never get the answer to, right? Because it's probably deep inside the profit and loss statements beyond what we're going to hear from these publicly traded companies. But it's a really interesting thing when we discuss, is it continually acquiring new customers to churn at that level, or are you trying to retain some of these players who are losing at higher numbers than other customers?
And Eric, I want to circle this back again to kind of our past lives or whatever. And this is all I have to draw from. And so I should clarify all of this, right? Like, I am making opinionated statements here, and kind of like I am making my own forward-looking statements that aren't backed up by any sort of scientific data and research right now, because all I'm going from is stuff we have from the past, right? So we saw it in the poker world, we saw it in the DFS world, right? It's like when it's super hot and everyone's in and whatever, and then you see it becomes this slow attrition whenever people realize somewhere along the way that I'm not good at this anymore, right? And then so you see, it's like there's sustainability, and then it just starts trickling off and trickling off and trickling off. We saw it in poker. We saw it in DFS. I don't know that it will be apples to apples in sports betting. I do believe there are a healthy amount of these people that are the high hold customer that at some point are going to look and go, man, I lose these damn things every single time I do them. And like that doesn't mean they're going to quit doing them. They might still do them every now and then or whatever. But I think that the like, hey, doing this multiple times a week or doing them for $20 now becomes doing them for $10 and doing them for $10 becomes doing them for $5, whatever it might be. I do think there becomes a point where there is at least a little bit of self-realization amongst the customer as well, which we saw in these other semi-parallel industries, like not apples to apples, to where there is going to be that, right? And so that's why I just keep, it's a guess for me what's going to happen 5, 6, 7 years down the road. But I do think that the reason they're so worried about this now is because they know what this is going to look like further down the line.
Yes, totally agree with you on all of that. Just to, restate what Adam said, we just haven't seen it yet, as far as we can tell in sports betting. What that means is open to interpretation. I think part of that is it does come down to product and the betting menu that operators like DraftKings and FanDuel have been able to provide. It's somewhat different in DFS, and I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but there's a bigger entertainment component, I think, in casual sports betting than there ever was in casual DFS. I think there's a lot of players who do zero research and just want to get $5 down on a multi-leg parlay and have a little sweat while they watch the game, and that certainly won't go away as easily. But there's obviously a valid point you make about the long-term impact of this, and really, we're talking about $220 million of revenue for DraftKings. Remember, that's $220 million being funneled out of the sports betting ecosystem, the customer balances. So yeah, there's certainly a big impact to think about down the road.
Matt, to that idea, I think here's where the big difference is. The big difference is with DFS and with poker, you might realize I'm not good at this, but the trick is in those endeavors, you're playing against someone who is better than you. Right? And that person is the one who is beating you. And you realize eventually, I can't beat someone who is either that much better than me or has technological advantages that I don't, or algorithms or multi-entries and all of these things. Whereas with sports betting, there hasn't really been that air quotes enemy, right? Like it's just you bet against the house and what happens. DraftKings is risking creating that enemy. Right? Like they're risking creating that enemy of being like, oh yeah, we are the ones just charging you more to be able to do it. And Jason Robbins said, we think people will be willing to stay with our product because we have a better product than others. We're going to find out, right? I don't know. They're the ones who've probably done the market research to know whether that's the case or not. But if DraftKings ends up on an island here, if others don't follow, then we are going to get a pretty clear test case of whether that idea plays out.